Good should ultimately prevail in professional wrestling. It exists, or so we're told, by WWE to put smiles on people's faces, and if you've been watching that product long enough, I understand why you might be a bit confused and how that might be unclear. But technically, that's what wrestling is meant to do. Unfortunately, due to its similarities to a soap opera, that means there is very few opportunities for actual happy endings, because, let's face it, it never ends. But in theory, the good guy should win when it's right for the good guy to win. Or at least, that's how it's supposed to go. I am Adam Nicholas, this is What Culture Wrestling, and these are 10 wrestling storylines where evil won. Number 10, Triple H vs Booker T. Now, to borrow a phrase from Adam Wilborn, is this the worst thing that WWE did ever? Forget the choo-choo noises of Braun Strowman, the gross infantilization of Alexa Bliss, and the total destruction of tag team wrestling in the company right now. These things, and yes, they all took place on a very recent episode of Monday Night Raw, were mere atrocities of fiction for which WWE has become infamous in recent years. But the idea that here is your winner and still the WWE Heavyweight Champion, the white supremacist of a storyline, was a level of disgusting that's scarcely believable. On his Something to Wrestle With podcast, Bruce Pritchard is adamant that, when Triple H said, "People like you don't get to be world champion" to Booker T, he was referring to the man's status as a WCW wrestler. Which is stupid really, because Booker T was already a 5-time world champion, and Triple H knew this because the belt that Booker T had won was the exact same one he was wearing around his waist at the time. He never said WCW guy Goldberg had nappy hair, and he never said WCW guy Sting should merely dance for his entertainment. And even The Undertaker didn't treat WCW guy Diamond Dallas Page like a bathroom attendant. This was, unmistakably, a storyline in which the avatar of institutional racism defeated the black man and took 23 whole seconds to make the cover. Disgusting. Number 9, Triple H vs Sting. At Survivor Series 2014, Sting debuted for the WWE as the very last holdout, the ultimate outsider. So entrenched was Sting as the enemy that he debuted as the vigilante with a calling to dismantle the corrupt system once and for all. After a wild, twisting main event, Sting took Triple H down with the Scorpion Death Drop to equalise the interference and restore justice. Sting couldn't join WWE without first saving it. There was a certain poetry to the angle informed by years of history converging. It was actually good storytelling. And then WWE changed it nonsensically at the 11th hour. Sometime ahead of WrestleMania, the big brains of WWE seemed to work themselves into a shoot. What the hell's this guy's problem? We're the best, they said, growing annoyed by the scripted events that they'd penned themselves. And at WrestleMania 31, suddenly Sting was the embodiment of WCW, fighting the last battle of a war that ended 14 years prior. He was assisted on the battlefield by the NWO, with whom he'd quite famously feuded, and lost because WWE is the best, it's the very best, the very, very best, the end. Number 8, Stephanie McMahon vs Mick Foley. This was as weird as it was depressing, as it was boring, as it was, in the end, thoroughly anticlimactic. In 2016, Mick Foley was installed by Stephanie McMahon as the general manager of Monday Night Raw. Foley, lovable folk hero, operated as a fair authority figure, which annoyed Stephanie McMahon, the heel. She expressed annoyance with babyface Dean Ambrose, scruffy, and the heel Charlotte Flair, nasty to her dad, across 2 episodes of the programme. Her character simply was that of an insufferable and impossible to please commissioner who made up the rules as she went along. She'd say things like, "What do you have to say for yourself?" as if Mick Foley was an insolent toddler. Foley, in response, would meekly concede that Stephanie was right and can he still have a job? Pretty please, pretty please. The whole thing was an oppressive viewing experience with no entertainment value, nor any catharsis. And in the end, Foley was simply bounced out unceremoniously, wasting almost an entire year of TV on ridicule and misery. Number 7, Kofi Mania. 11 long years. The Kofi Mania storyline was premised on 11 years of struggle. Kofi wished to prove himself a true headline player. He had the ability, the drive, and, in a genuinely stirring organic development, he had the support too. So why then did it take 11 long years? In storyline, this was partly explained away by Vince McMahon, believing Kofi to be a B+ player, where have we heard that before, who was destined for the Hall of Fame, just not the first ballot. Regardless, in a euphoric moment, Kofi realised his ambitions after dethroning Planet's champion Daniel Bryan in a masterclass at WrestleMania 35. It was a brilliant emotional match that articulated the scope of Kofi's struggle within 24 minutes of spellbinding drama. It was by some distance the best moment of the run. Virtually every other match developed an unshakable mid-card vibe, and in truth, through its pointless mandated rematches, the run went on too long. But the way in which it ended was a brutally depressing reminder of where WWE thought Kofi stood all along. He was absolutely annihilated by Brock Lesnar on the SmackDown Fox debut. He wasn't considered a headliner, hell, he wasn't even considered a B+ player. He was just considered as a guy who was there to do the job. Number 6, Austin vs McMahon. The highlight of a generation's wrestling fandom, Austin vs McMahon, was a saga as entertaining as it was epic. McMahon was seminal as the hammy, ass-showing menace, and Austin hilarious as the man who kicked him there when the pants were down. Sublime physical comedy converged with outrageous stakes, perfect for the cliffhanger episodic model to make the WWF the only destination on Monday nights. But in the end, of course, evil prevailed. Vince loathed the idea of Austin holding the WWF title and had asked him to be a corporate man to better embody what that meant. And in 1998, Austin hit him in the dick, but in 2001, Austin shook him by the hand. Years later, Austin side-eyed McMahon in various segments that sort of forget all that silly business-killing bother, and McMahon ate the old stunner on various retro shows. But in the real end, he got his man. Number 5. The Miz vs Daniel Bryan. A fusion of reality and fiction, sometimes within the same worked segments, Daniel Bryan and The Miz were diametric opposites. Bryan was the in-ring killer who treated wrestling as art to the detriment of his health, whereas The Miz valued doing his job safely so that he'd never miss a date or a responsibility. When this was adapted into their criminally piss-poor program of 2016, WWE couldn't exactly go full meta. The Bryan and Miz conflict was repurposed as more traditional affair. Bryan was virtuous and Miz took the shortcuts, and in the end, after a shockingly subdued crowd reaction at SummerSlam indicated this outrageous botch of a program, Bryan won in 2 minutes at Super Showdown with a small cradle. Now, Bryan technically won the feud in the most anticlimactic fashion possible, but he lost his character in doing so. He turned heel almost immediately after it ended, sensing that the fickle fans who sat on their hands were no longer behind him. Number 4. Stephanie McMahon vs Brie Bella. In an attempt to extract every last bit of juice from the Daniel Bryan vs The Authority storyline, Brie Bella was folded into the saga long after it was dead, and in a miraculous development, this subplot was actually really good. It was good because Stephanie McMahon was a great heel character, undermined by just one rather glaring flaw. She simply cannot put anybody over. Wonder where she gets that from. And since that is the exact goddamn point, most everything she did from 2013 onwards, beyond the odd obligatory bump at WrestleMania, was simply unbearable. I mean, her delivery was really good, but still unbearable. Brie slapped the giggling Stephanie square in the mouth, and it was great. It was the end game for Stephanie's very character. Steph slapped back when the feud heated up and eventually won the match at the pay-per-view when Nikki turned on her sister. Evil won, and WWE separated a big drawing act, only to put them back together when Brie also turned heel. Good escapism, that. Number 3. CM Punk vs Jeff Hardy. Now, in this particular instance, evil prevailed for a reason. Jeff Hardy was on the way out, and WWE made sure to get CM Punk over at his expense. Arguably, this was the best wholly fictional A to Z story WWE penned post-2001. Punk vs Hardy was gloriously simple. Punk was jeered for winning the Money in the Bank briefcase for a second consecutive year. Punk cashed in on Jeff Hardy, further disconnecting him from the fanbase, and used that reaction to inform his exceptional sanctimonious heel act. After a slow burn turn plotted tremendously, Punk raged that Jeff Hardy was no hero. He was an unreliable drug addict who didn't deserve the love of the WWE Universe. This program peaked fabulously across a pair of stunning gimmick matches, the best singles TLC match ever, the symbolism of which formalised Punk's superiority, and a loser leaves town cage match. Still, as effective as it was, the specific beats of the story were a little bit jarring. The flawed hero, in the end, was just flawed, and it wasn't that effective since the Undertaker program undid everything just months later. As a self-contained story, however, this was incredible. Number 2. Edge vs Matt Hardy. Alright, this one's not exactly a tale of good versus evil so much as it's a tale of, okay, how do we say this? Adulterer versus toxic emo who mobilised his fans against his ex, who the fans, being the wrestling fans, treated as the heel in the corny adaptation of a distressing love triangle. You still following? It's a little bit more complex than simply labelling Hardy as the good guy in all of this, since he had no qualms about publicising the matter and doing less than nothing to stem the backlash that all but scorched Lita's psyche. I mean, he wasn't to know that Lita would be turned into a one-dimensional quote-unquote slut character, nor was he to know that the character would become so over and so established for this transgression that Vince would later threaten to fire her if she refused to participate in the infamous live sex celebration. I mean, looking back at it, this whole deal was just such a mess, and the catharsis was never realised in the fiction. Hardy was beaten down horribly at SummerSlam, and while he gained a measure of revenge at Unforgiven, the lasting memory of this one is ultimately Hardy's loss. The lesser of the evils lost because WWE, truth be told, saw more money in the man Edge, who was lionised as the entertaining heel shagger. And ain't that the truth? And number 1, with a bullet, Shawn Michaels vs Bret Hart. People have debated for years who was the better wrestler between Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart. The The snug, hermetic strategy of Bret Hart, who really did embody his excellence of execution moniker, or the searing melodramatic flash of Shawn Michaels, who did, in fact, stop so many a show with his big bumping thrill rides. Now, wherever you land on that particular conversation, well, that's a whole other thing. What is very clear though between these two is just who was the good guy and who was the bad guy. Shawn Michaels was the bad guy. Shawn Michaels was the man who cultivated a toxic atmosphere. Michaels was the man who dropped a title without doing a job and returned ahead of schedule to confirm that he more than likely could have gone out on his back after all. And Michaels was the man who, setting the events of Montreal into motion, directly told Bret Hart that he wouldn't do the job and lie clean in the middle for him ever again. However, despite all of that, Michaels wasn't the man who pitched the screw job. But he did go along with it, and he did at least have the humanity to cut a despondent figure backstage in a moment of introspection.